My stepfather sold my dead father's watch collection for cash, 30 years of watches, each one engraved with a message meant for me. I thought they were gone forever, that my last connection to my father had been stripped away. Then I got a call from a pawn shop owner 3 towns over. He said, "I've had these in my case for a week. I couldn't sell them. The engraving on the back." It felt like someone was supposed to come looking. My name is Christine. I'm 29. The call from the pawn shop came on a Tuesday, and I drove 80 miles praying the watches were still there. What I didn't know was that one watch held a secret, proof my stepfather had been stealing from me for years. Before I tell you the rest, please like and subscribe. Let me take you back to when my father was alive, and every birthday he gave me a new watch with a message engraved. Let me take you back to when my father was alive, and every birthday he gave me a new watch with a message engraved. My father, Edward, was not a wealthy man. He worked 40 years as a machinist at a tool and die shop in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place that smelled like cutting oil and hot metal. But he had one obsession: timepieces. Every Saturday morning, he'd take me to the flea market on Valley Street to hunt for broken watches. He'd bring them home, spread a soft cloth on the kitchen table, and teach me how to clean the movements with a tiny brush. He said a watch wasn't for telling time, it was for remembering it. The tradition started when I was born. He bought a vintage 1972 Omega Seamaster on the day of my delivery, a watch older than me by 2 decades. He engraved the back, "Christine, my first hour of forever." He gave it to me on my 16th birthday, the first time he sat me down and explained that one day this collection would be mine, not to sell, to hold. To remember that every second I was on this earth, I was loved. Every year after that, he added a piece. A stainless steel Hamilton with a sunburst dial for my 17th. "For the light you carry." A Tissot chronograph for my graduation. "Timing doesn't matter, direction does." He never missed a year. By the time I turned 23, I had 23 watches, each wrapped in felt, stored in a cherrywood box he built himself. I didn't know it then, but that box was a diary written in metal and glass. Then, 2 weeks after my 23rd birthday, my father collapsed in the shop. A brain aneurysm. They said he was gone before he hit the concrete floor. I didn't cry at first. I drove to the flea market alone, sat in the parking lot, and stared at the empty passenger seat. A man without a watch is a man adrift, he'd always tell me. I suddenly understood what he meant. The funeral was a blur. But I remember one thing clearly. My mother, Linda, standing with a man I barely recognized. Gary, a real estate agent she'd met at a grief support group 6 months earlier. They'd been dating, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own life to notice. He had a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. 3 months after the funeral, they married at the courthouse. Gary moved into our house. At first, he was helpful. He built shelves in the garage. He told my mother she deserved to be happy now. But quietly, things began to shift. The cherrywood watch box, which I'd kept in my bedroom closet, moved to the basement. "Just organizing," Gary said. Then some of my father's tools disappeared. His coin collection, a first edition Hemingway he'd treasured. When I asked, Gary would shrug and say, "Your mom and I decided to clear out some clutter. Don't worry, nothing important." I was 25, working 2 jobs, trying to save for my own place. I wasn't home enough to notice the slow bleed. But one evening I went to the basement to add my 24th birthday watch, a gift I'd bought myself in my father's memory, and I found the box empty, every watch gone. The felt liners were still there, imprinted with the shapes of the missing cases. I stood there, heart hammering, and ran upstairs. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face pale. Gary stood behind her, hands on her shoulders. "Christine, sit down," he said. "We need to talk." I didn't sit. "Where are they?" Gary exhaled slowly. "I sold them. We needed the money. Your mother's medical bills were piling up. I didn't think you'd mind." The air left my lungs. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "You sold my father's watches," I whispered. "All of them." "Just things," Gary said. "He would have wanted you to be practical." I said nothing. I turned, walked to my room, and closed the door. The silence was immense. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I started searching. I called every pawn shop in Dayton, then everyone in the surrounding counties. I filed a police report, but the officer told me it was a civil matter, family dispute, hard to prosecute. For 2 years, I found nothing. Not a single watch surfaced. I began to believe they were gone forever, melted down or scattered across the country, their engravings meaningless to strangers. But what I didn't know was that one watch held a secret, a slip of paper so small it was invisible inside the case back. And Gary had been quietly selling my father's belongings for years. not to pay medical bills, but to feed a debt I never knew existed. And the person who finally uncovered the truth wasn't a detective or a lawyer. It was a pawn shop owner named Frank, who did something most people in his business would never do. He refused to sell what wasn't his to give. I didn't know it then, but the man who would change everything was already holding the watches I'd been searching for. His name was Frank Delaney, and he owned a small pawn shop called Ridgewood Pawn in a town named Millsboro, 3 hours south of the Ohio River. Frank had gray hair, thick glasses, and a rule he'd never broken in 17 years. If something smells wrong, you don't sell it. Not for any price. Gary walked into Ridgewood Pawn on a Thursday afternoon in early March. He was wearing a sport coat that looked a size too big, and he carried a duffel bag, not the cherrywood box. Frank noticed that immediately. A man with 23 high-end watches doesn't carry them in a gym bag unless he's in a hurry or he doesn't value them at all. Gary lifted the bag onto the counter and unzipped it. Frank saw the glint of polished steel and gold. He pulled out the first watch, a vintage Omega Seamaster. He turned it over. The engraving read, "Christine, my first hour of forever." Frank looked up but said nothing. He reached for the next one. "For the light you carry." And the next. Timing doesn't matter, direction does. All of them, every single one, had a woman's name and a message that sounded like it came from a father. "Who's Christine?" Frank asked. Gary didn't blink. "My stepdaughter, she's doing a purge, wants the cash for a new apartment." Frank nodded slowly. In his head, he was already doing the math. A young woman purging her dead father's watches, all engraved with the kind of love that takes years to write. It didn't add up. He asked for identification. Gary produced a driver's license and signed the pawn slip. Frank offered him $450 for the lot. Gary took it. That alone was a red flag. A man selling heirlooms worth maybe $15,000 for $400 is either desperate or hiding something. After Gary left, Frank did something he rarely does. He pulled the entire collection from the display case before it ever hit the shelf. He locked them in his back safe and sat down at his computer. He searched the name Christine Dayton Watch Engraving. Nothing. Then he called a number he knew from years of dealing with stolen goods, the county sheriff's property crimes unit. He gave them the name from the license, the description of the watches, and the engravings. The deputy on duty pulled up a file. A missing persons. No, a cold report, a theft report filed 2 years ago by a woman named Christine Marker. She'd listed 24 engraved watches as stolen by a family member, a stepfather. The deputy gave Frank her phone number. That night, Frank dialed. I was sitting in my apartment, eating cold pasta and scrolling through yet another dead-end online listing when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Christine." The voice was older, careful. "My name is Frank Delaney. I own a pawn shop in Millsboro. I think I have something that belongs to you." I don't remember what I said. I think I just listened as he described the Omega with the word forever and the Hamilton with the light you carry. My father's voice was in every description. I started shaking so hard I had to set the phone on speaker and press it against my thigh. "These watches," Frank continued, "they've been sitting in my safe for 6 days. I couldn't sell them. The engravings, they felt like someone was supposed to come looking, so I looked. I managed to ask where he was. He gave me the address. I said I'd be there tomorrow. He told me to bring the police report and any proof that the watches were mine. I said I would. But here's the thing I couldn't understand yet. If Frank had all 23 watches, what else had Gary been selling? And why was the newest watch in Frank's safe not one of my father's, but one Gary had brought from his own nightstand, a cheap gold-plated Timex with an engraving that didn't match the others? Frank noticed the anomaly because it wasn't a high-end watch. It was a man's watch, worn and scuffed, with the initials GEM on the back. He hadn't put it in the safe with the others. He'd left it on his workbench, meaning to check if it was even worth anything. That watch, the one that didn't belong, was the one that would eventually reveal everything. But I didn't know that as I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. I only knew that after 2 years of silence, someone had finally said my name back to me. And I was about to discover that my stepfather hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd been burying a secret so deep that recovering one watch would set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. I drove to Millsboro the next morning. 3 hours of highway with my hands tight on the wheel and my father's voice in my head. When I walked into Ridgewood Pawn, the bell above the door chimed and Frank looked up from behind the counter. He didn't ask for ID. He just looked at me and said, "You're Christine." I nodded. He disappeared into the back, returned with a felt-lined tray, and set 23 watches on the counter between us. I picked up the Omega first. My first hour of forever. I pressed it to my palm and felt the weight of it. The Hamilton, the Tissot, every one of them. I counted them twice, 23. The entire collection intact. Frank had kept them exactly as Gary brought them in, still in the same duffel bag. I tried to pay him back the $450. He refused. Just take them home, he said. That's payment enough. But before I left, Frank stopped me. He reached under the counter and pulled out one more watch, the gold-plated Timex. This one was with the others, he said, but it doesn't match. The engraving is just initials. GEM, I thought maybe it belonged to your father too, but now I'm not sure. I turned it over. GEM Gary Edward Marker, my stepfather's initials. This wasn't my father's watch, it was Gary's. And Frank had found it in the duffel with my father's collection. Why would Gary pawn his own watch with the ones he stole from me? I didn't have an answer, but the question burrowed into my brain. I took the Timex home along with the 23 watches. That night, I sat on my apartment floor and opened the cherrywood box Gary had emptied 2 years ago. I laid each watch back into its slot, one by one, like returning bones to a body. When I got to the Omega, something rattled inside the case. A faint sound like a grain of sand. I unscrewed the case back. Inside, folded smaller than a postage stamp, was a slip of paper. I carefully unfolded it with tweezers. A series of numbers written in my father's handwriting, an account number. Below it, 2 words, Christine's Bond. My father had hidden a savings bond account number inside the watch he gave me, a bond I never knew existed. He'd put it there years ago, assuming the watch would always be with me. He never imagined someone would sell it. And if Gary hadn't pawned the watches, if Frank hadn't held them back, that slip of paper would have stayed hidden until it was too late. Bonds have maturity dates. Some expire after 30 years. I didn't know how long this one had been waiting. The next morning, I called the Treasury Department. I gave them the number. The representative on the phone paused, then said, "Miss Marker, this bond was issued in 1992, 30 years ago. It matured last year. The current value with accrued interest is just over $83,000. I sat down. My father had left me $83,000, hidden inside a watch Gary sold for maybe $20. But why would Gary need to sell my father's watches at all if my mother's medical bills weren't real? That question started me digging. I requested copies of my mother's medical records. I knew she'd had a minor surgery 3 years ago, something routine. The hospital statement showed the total out-of-pocket cost was $1,200, not the tens of thousands Gary had claimed. There were no piles of medical debt. Gary had lied. Then I pulled the bank statements for the joint account my mother shared with Gary. Large cash deposits, always under $10,000, spaced out over 2 years. Deposits that lined up with the dates I now knew he'd sold my father's things. The coin collection, the Hemingway, the tools. The total was staggering. Almost $60,000 of my father's possessions, converted to cash, deposited in small amounts to avoid reporting requirements. Structuring payments. A federal crime. But it got worse. One of the deposits matched the exact date and amount of a withdrawal from the same bank, paid to a local collection agency. I called the agency, pretending to be a family member inquiring about a debt. The representative confirmed. Gary Marker had an outstanding gambling debt of over $90,000. He'd been paying it down for years. My father's watches, his books, his tools, they'd been funding a gambling addiction my mother knew nothing about. I sat with that information for 2 days. Then I drove to my mother's house. She was alone. Gary was at work. I laid the account statements, the medical records, and a photo of the savings bond slip on her kitchen table. I told her about Frank. About the pawn shop. About the $83,000 my father had hidden for me, and then I told her about the gambling debt. Her face went white. She didn't cry, not at first. She just stared at the papers like they were written in a language she didn't understand. "He told me the watches were for you," she whispered. "He said he was sending them to a watchmaker for cleaning before giving them back to you." Gary had lied to both of us. And my mother, in her grief, had trusted the man who was dismantling her dead husband's legacy piece by piece. I hugged her. I told her she wasn't at fault. But I also told her that Gary had to be confronted, and it had to be soon. Because if he'd taken the watches, he might have taken other things we hadn't found yet. Things my father may have hidden from me, thinking I'd come looking. That night, my mother called Gary and told him to come home. He had no idea what was waiting. And I was finally ready to look him in the eye and ask the question that had been burning in my chest for 2 years. How many pieces of my father did you sell before I even noticed they were gone? Gary walked through the front door at 7:15 that evening. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table. The bank statements and medical records spread in front of her like evidence for a trial, because that's exactly what they were. I stood by the window, arms crossed, my father's omega already on my wrist. Hadn't left my skin since Frank returned it. Gary saw the watch first, then he saw the papers, and for one long second his expression flickered between confusion and something colder. "We need to talk," my mother said. Her voice was quiet, but there was iron under it. Gary tried to smile. "Is this about the watches? Christine, I was going to get them back. I just needed short-term cash, a pawn loan. I had every intention." "You sold them for $450, I said. "You signed a pawn slip. Frank at Ridgewood Pawn has the receipt. You never intended to reclaim them, Gary. You didn't even bring the box. You stuffed them in a gym bag like they were junk." The smile vanished. "You don't understand. The store was struggling. I had debts, your mother's expenses. Her medical bills were $1,200, I said. "I have the statements. You told us you needed tens of thousands. That was a lie. And I have the bank records showing regular cash deposits, all under 10,000, all matching the dates you sold my father's things." Gary's eyes moved to my mother, then back to me. His face hardened. "I don't know what you think you found, but that money went into the household account. We both used it. Ask her." My mother spoke, her voice breaking. "You told me the watches were at a repair shop. You told me they'd be back for Christine's next birthday. I believed you, Gary. For 2 years, I believed you. And all that time, you were pawning her inheritance to pay off gambling debts you never told me about." That word, gambling, landed like a physical blow. Gary flinched. "Who told you that?" "The collection agency confirmed it when I called them this morning," I said. $90,000, Gary. That's how deep you are. And you've been liquidating my father's estate to service it, one piece at a time." Gary sat down heavily in the chair opposite my mother. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "I was going to fix it, once the big win came through." "There is no big win," my mother said. Her tears had stopped. Now she just looked exhausted. "There never was. You've been living inside a lie and you dragged me into it. You made me complicit in stealing from my own daughter." Gary reached for her hand. She pulled it away. "Linda, please, I love you." "If you loved me," she said, "you wouldn't have sold my dead husband's watch collection and told me it was for cleaning. You wouldn't have watched Christine grieve those watches for 2 years while you pocketed cash and fed an addiction behind our backs. You don't get to say you love me. Not anymore." I watched my mother in that moment. She wasn't the woman who'd sat silently while Gary explained away the missing tools and the books. She was someone waking up from a very long sleep. And in that wakefulness, she was already grieving the marriage she thought she had. Then I reached into my pocket and unfolded the tiny slip of paper I'd found inside the Omega. I laid it on the table. "There's something else. My father hid a savings bond account number inside that watch, a bond he bought the year I was born. It's worth $83,000 now, Gary. The watch you sold for maybe $20 was carrying a secret you never bothered to check for." Gary stared at the slip. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For the first time, he looked not just caught, but defeated. "I didn't know," he said. "How could I have known?" "You couldn't," I replied, "because you never looked at those watches as anything but currency. My father built a legacy inside those cases, and you treated them like scrap metal. But that's not even the worst part." I pulled out the cheap gold-plated Timex from my bag and set it beside the other papers. "Frank found this with my father's collection." "It's yours, Gary. I thought so at first because of the initials on the back. But when I examined it tonight, I realized something. Those aren't your initials. You never owned a watch with an engraving. You never valued things that way." I turned the Timex over. Under the thin light of the kitchen, I unscrewed the back with a coin from my pocket, the way my father taught me. Inside, pressed flat against the movement, was a second folded slip of paper, even smaller than the first. I'd found it only an hour before, when I'd been examining every watch one last time, and I'd remembered what Frank said about how this one didn't match. I'd pried it open, and my knees nearly buckled. I unfolded the paper now and read aloud. "Christine, if you're reading this, the Omega brought you here. This Timex was my backup. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of the cherrywood box. Safety Deposit Box 712, First National Bank. Love, Dad." Gary's face went pale. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. The cherrywood box, the same box Gary had emptied and shoved into the basement, the box I'd carried back to my apartment to restore the watches, had been holding the final piece all along. "Your father knew," my mother whispered. He knew something like this might happen. He planted a trail that only you would follow. Gary said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He stood slowly, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled out a suitcase. My mother didn't stop him. I didn't either. I was already picturing the key, the box, the last gift my father had hidden from a man who'd never understood what it meant to be a father. And as Gary's footsteps faded toward the front door, I realized the watches hadn't just been recovered. They had led me, step by step, to a truth my father had set in motion the year I was born, knowing that one day I'd be old enough and hurt enough to finally go looking. I didn't just get the watches back. I got the message my father had hidden inside them more than 2 decades ago. That love, real love, plans ahead. It doesn't wait for an emergency. It prepares for one. My father couldn't predict Gary. He couldn't know that a debt-ridden stepfather would strip his legacy for parts. But he knew the world could be careless with things it didn't understand. So he built a treasure map inside his own gifts, one only his daughter would ever know to follow. Frank Delaney, the pawn shop owner, is still in Millsboro. He still has that rule pinned behind his counter. If something smells wrong, you don't sell it. We talk once a month now. He keeps a photo of the cherrywood box on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that paying attention can change someone's entire life. As for Gary, I never pressed charges. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because my mother asked me not to. Their marriage unraveled within weeks. He moved out of state that August, and I haven't heard his voice since. The gambling debts are his problem now. The savings bond, the safety deposit box, the key taped under the drawer, those are mine. My father left me more than money. He left me proof that I was seen, long before I ever had to fight for what was mine. If you've ever had something taken from you, something that held a promise, a memory, a name, I want you to know that it's not always gone for good. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right person to refuse to sell. That stranger could be a pawn shop owner. Or it could be you, years from now, following a trail that was laid before you knew you'd need it. I have a question for you. What's one thing from someone you love that you would fight to recover, no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to believe that lost things can come back. Hit that subscribe button, because I'm not done telling stories about what happens when ordinary people refuse to let go. Thank you for listening. My father would have loved knowing you were here.